By the summer of 1942, Malta was closer to collapse than at any other moment of the war. Once celebrated as the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Mediterranean, the island now resembled a scarred fortress barely holding on to life. German and Italian bombers struck it almost daily. Over 3,000 air raids had reduced its ports, runways, and towns to rubble. Civilians lived in caves and shelters carved into the limestone, emerging only long enough to gather their meager rations before the next attack sirens howled across Valletta. Food stocks had dwindled to a few weeks. Fuel reserves were so low that the island's aircraft could barely scramble, and its submarines, crucial for sabotaging Axis supply lines to North Africa, were trapped in harbor. Without fuel, Malta could no longer threaten Rommel's convoys. Without food, its people would soon starve. And without ammunition, its defenders would be unable to resist a future invasion. London understood the stakes. If Malta fell, the entire balance of the Mediterranean would shift. Rommel's Africa Corps, already pushing toward Egypt, would gain uninterrupted supply lines. The Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil fields would be at risk. Britain would lose its foothold in the central Mediterranean, and the Allies would lose a critical base needed for any future offensive. Thus emerged a single desperate conclusion. Malta must survive at all costs, and only one plan, dangerous, improbable, almost suicidal, offered hope of saving it. As Malta's situation grew desperate, the British War Cabinet convened in London to consider the unthinkable. Every convoy sent to the island in the preceding months had been shattered, torpedoed, bombed, or scattered by Axis forces that dominated the central Mediterranean. The Strait of Sicily had become a killing ground, yet the island would not survive another month without a massive resupply effort. Something far larger, far riskier had to be attempted. It was Winston Churchill who pushed the decision forward. Malta must be saved, he declared, no matter the cost. Behind closed doors, planners began assembling one of the most heavily protected convoys in British naval history. The operation received a name that reflected its weight: pedestal, a symbol of holding Malta aloft above the sea of fire closing in around it. The convoy would consist of 14 merchant ships and a powerful escort force, 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers, and more than 24 destroyers. This armada would be tasked not only with delivering fuel, grain, ammunition, and spare parts, but with protecting one ship above all others: the American-built tanker SS Ohio, the only vessel capable of carrying enough aviation fuel to revive Malta's dying air force. Admirals warned that the losses might be catastrophic. Intelligence reports confirmed that German U-boats, Italian submarines, Stuka dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fast attack boats awaited them. But there was no alternative. Malta would stand or fall on the success of a single voyage. Operation Pedestal was set in motion, a gamble of steel, fire, and fate. On the evening of August 10th, 1942, the greatest relief convoy ever assembled for Malta slipped out of Gibraltar and into the open Mediterranean. The sea was calm, but tension rippled across every deck. Sailors knew the route ahead was among the most dangerous in the world. Narrow waters watched day and night by Axis aircraft, submarines, and patrol boats. At the spearhead moved Britain's proud capital ships, the battleships HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney, followed by 4 aircraft carriers: Victorious, Indomitable, Eagle, and Furious, their flight decks busy with aircraft checks and final preparations. Behind them came the lifeblood of the mission, 14 merchant vessels carrying food, ammunition, spare parts, and the precious cargo of the tanker SS Ohio. Inside the convoy lanes, crews whispered about past convoys that had perished in these same waters. Yet there was also resolve. Many understood that Malta's survival depended on them. If they failed, an entire theater of the war could shift in Germany's favor. As night settled, the convoy maintained strict blackout. Only the faint silhouettes of ships were visible, gliding across the dark horizon like phantoms. Escorts zigzagged aggressively, listening for submarine engines. Above, carrier aircraft patrolled in rotating shifts, their engines a constant reminder that danger could appear at any moment. Radio operators intercepted Italian signals, confirming what everyone already suspected. The Axis new pedestal was coming. The question was not if the attacks would begin, but when. For now, the convoy pressed eastward, deeper into enemy territory, toward the gauntlet awaiting them. By August 11th, the convoy approached the narrow, treacherous waters between Tunisia and Sicily, the point where every British admiral knew the real battle would begin. The Strait of Sicily was a natural bottleneck, a hunting ground saturated with Axis submarines, minefields, and patrol aircraft. No convoy had passed through this region unscathed. Just after dawn, hydrophone operators aboard the destroyers picked up the first telltale sound, the distant pulse of diesel engines beneath the waves. Moments later, the submarine U-73 launched a spread of torpedoes toward the carrier HMS Eagle. Lookouts spotted them too late. A thunderous explosion ripped through Eagle's hull, followed by another and another. Within minutes, the proud carrier, the third largest ship in the convoy, began to list heavily. Sailors scrambled to abandon ship as aircraft toppled from the flight deck into the sea. Escort ships rushed in, hauling survivors aboard while keeping watch for further submarine attacks. At 1:15 p.m., HMS Eagle rolled to her side and sank. Over 900 men were rescued, but 131 never surfaced. The loss sent a shock wave through the fleet. If one of Britain's most valuable carriers could fall so quickly, what awaited the merchantmen deeper into the strait? But the enemy was not finished. Italian submarines joined the hunt, launching torpedoes that forced the convoy into evasive zigzags. Merchant ships heaved violently as destroyers dropped depth charges, their blasts echoing through the narrow channel. By nightfall, Pedestal had survived its first true test, but at a terrible price. The ships sailed on, their formation now tighter, their nerves stretched thin, knowing the worst was still ahead. The morning of August 12th brought no relief. As the sun rose over the Mediterranean, Axis reconnaissance aircraft circled high above the convoy, signaling what every sailor already feared. The air assaults were about to begin. Within hours, the horizon darkened with the silhouettes of German Ju-88 bombers and Italian torpedo aircraft sweeping in from Sicily and Sardinia. The first wave descended with terrifying precision. Stuka dive bombers peeled out of the sky, their screaming sirens echoing across the convoy as they plunged toward the merchant ships and their escorts. Destroyers laid dense curtains of anti-aircraft fire, tracers arcing upward like streams of molten steel. Explosions rippled across the sea as bombs struck the water, sending geysers towering above the decks. Then came the torpedo bombers, low, fast, and deadly. Italian SM-79 Sparviero aircraft skimmed the surface, dropping their torpedoes in perfectly spaced patterns designed to trap the lumbering merchantmen. HMS Indomitable took several near hits as her fighters scrambled to intercept, while cruisers weaved desperately to avoid the spreading fan of torpedoes slicing through the waves. One merchant ship, the Wirangi, was hit and engulfed in flames. Another, Clan Ferguson, took a direct bomb strike that split her open, sending her crew into the sea. The convoy tightened formation, but their reduced numbers made the losses painfully visible. Despite the chaos, the air defenses inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers. Dozens of Axis aircraft fell burning into the water, but the assault was relentless, wave after wave, hour after hour, draining ammunition, exhausting gunners, and testing the resolve of every man aboard. By sunset, the convoy had endured one of the most intense air attacks of the Mediterranean War. Malta was still far away, and the worst was yet to come. Among the merchant ships struggling through the inferno, one vessel drew more enemy fire than any other, the American-built tanker SS Ohio. Every Axis commander knew the truth. If Malta was to survive, Ohio had to be destroyed. Without her cargo of aviation fuel, the island's defenders would be powerless. By midday on August 12th, Ohio had already endured multiple near hits. Her decks were scorched, her railings torn by shrapnel, and several guns were out of action. But the worst came when a German torpedo bomber released its payload at close range. The torpedo detonated near her hull, lifting the massive tanker out of the water. Men were thrown across the deck as machinery tore loose and fires erupted below. Barely minutes later, two Ju-88s struck from above, dropping bombs that blasted apart Ohio's bridge and smashed through her decks. The shock wave killed or wounded much of her crew. The tanker staggered, losing speed, her engines failing as smoke poured from ruptured fuel lines. Captain Dudley Mason, covered in soot and blood, refused to abandon his ship. Crawling across shattered decking, he coordinated damage control, extinguished fires, and pushed the surviving crew to restart the crippled engines. His voice, calm, commanding, kept the men focused even as more bombers circled overhead. But Ohio's ordeal continued. A disabled German bomber, mortally hit by British fighters, crashed directly into the tanker's starboard side, embedding itself into the hull before sliding into the sea. The explosion nearly broke the tanker in two. Yet unbelievably, Ohio stayed afloat. By evening, she was barely moving. Her frame twisted, her decks cratered, but she was alive. And as long as she lived, so did Malta's hope. As Ohio drifted, half dead in the water, the convoy's escorts understood a brutal truth. If the tanker stopped now, the mission was lost. Fuel was life, and Malta would not survive without her. So the British destroyers, HMS Bramham and HMS Penn, prepared for one of the most extraordinary maneuvers in naval history. With Ohio barely able to steer, both destroyers moved alongside her, risking collision and enemy attack. Their hulls scraped violently against the tanker's sides, metal screeched as plates buckled. Lines were thrown, secured, and tightened. The goal was simple but perilous: to physically tow and stabilize Ohio by pushing against her flanks. Above them, Axis aircraft returned. Ju-87 Stukas screamed downward, unleashing bombs that exploded dangerously close. Shrapnel sliced across all three ships, wounding crewmen on the open decks. Yet the destroyers held position, their engines roaring as they forced the crippled tanker forward. Spray crashed over the bows. Every vibration threatened to snap the connecting lines. But Bramham and Penn refused to break away. Their captains coordinated every turn, every fraction of speed, every course correction as if guiding a wounded giant across a battlefield. By sunset, the strange formation, destroyer, tanker, destroyer, limped through the Mediterranean like a single wounded organism. Behind them, burning ships sank into the sea. Ahead of them lay Malta, still over the horizon, but waiting, desperately waiting. Ohio was no longer sailing under her own power. She was being carried, dragged toward salvation by sailors who understood that failure meant starvation, collapse, and surrender. The convoy had started as a fleet. Now its survival rested on 3 ships locked together, defying the Luftwaffe, the sea, and fate itself. On the morning of August 14, the battered remains of Operation Pedestal approached Malta. Ohio, scarred, sagging, and barely afloat, remained wedged between HMS Bramham and HMS Penn, her decks twisted from explosions, her crew exhausted beyond measure. But now, for the first time in days, the defenders of Malta could see her silhouette emerging through the shimmering haze on the horizon. Word spread across the island like electricity. Civilians ran to the cliffs, soldiers crowded the bastions, and church bells began to ring. They were not celebrating victory, only the possibility of survival. If Ohio arrived, Malta's airfields would live. Its fighters could rise again. Its starving people would hold on. But the approach was still dangerous. U-boats lurked south of Sicily. Luftwaffe patrols prowled overhead. Every hour brought new alarms. The formation crept forward at a painfully slow pace, the destroyers adjusting constantly to counter the tanker's unpredictable sway. Twice Ohio's keel groaned so violently that crews feared she might split in half before reaching port. Then just outside Valletta's Grand Harbor, the defenders offered their final gift. A flotilla of small harbor craft, tugs, launches, and even fishing boats rushed out to meet the convoy. Their crews threw lines aboard, shouting encouragement as they secured the half-sunken tanker for the last stretch. As the walls of the Grand Harbor rose around them, sailors on the destroyers saw something they would never forget. Thousands of Maltese citizens cheering, waving flags, and crying openly. Ohio did not sail into port. She was carried, dragged triumphantly between the stone fortifications like a wounded hero returning from battle. For a moment, the war seemed to pause. The island still faced hardship, but the fuel inside Ohio's broken hull meant one thing: Malta would live. When Ohio finally settled against the quayside inside Grand Harbor, the ship was so badly damaged that her deck sat nearly level with the water. Her keel was cracked, her engines dead, her hull flooded from stem to stern. She would never sail again, but none of it mattered. What she carried inside her shattered body was worth more than steel: 10,000 tons of precious aviation fuel. Teams of dock workers and sailors rushed aboard immediately. Pumps were lowered into the tanker's fractured compartments. Hoses were secured to whatever remained of her fuel lines. Every minute counted. The ship could break apart at any time, yet the oil began to flow. And as it flowed, Malta breathed again. Within hours, fuel trucks delivered the first barrels to Ta Kali, Lucca, and Hal Far airfields. Ground crews worked feverishly, refilling Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Beaufort torpedo bombers that had been sitting idle for days. Soon the roar of Merlin engines echoed across the island once more. Across Malta, civilians cheered as they saw the fighters rise into the sky. For the first time in months, the island's defenders had enough fuel to contest Axis air raids, strike enemy convoys, and protect the lifeline that Operation Pedestal had delivered. The impact was immediate. Axis commanders, realizing Malta was no longer helpless, reduced their bombing intensity. British submarines based in Malta resumed operations with devastating effect, striking at Rommel's supply lines and choking the North African front. Ohio's cargo did not win the war, but it changed its tempo. It kept Malta alive long enough for the Allies to seize the initiative in the Mediterranean. Her fuel powered the aircraft that shielded the island, disrupted Axis convoys, and paved the way for the victory at El Alamein only weeks later. Ohio herself was left permanently fused to the quay, too damaged to move. But on Malta, she was remembered not as a ship, but as a savior. Operation Pedestal ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Out of 14 merchant ships, only 5 reached Malta. 4 destroyers, 2 cruisers, and an aircraft carrier were damaged or sunk. Hundreds of sailors never returned home. Yet despite the devastation, the operation achieved the impossible. Malta survived. In Whitehall, military analysts examined the battle and reached a striking conclusion. Pedestal had not been a tactical victory, it had been a strategic necessity. Malta's revival transformed the entire Mediterranean War. From the island's airfields and submarine pens, Allied forces intensified attacks on Axis convoys, rushing to supply Rommel in North Africa. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts that once flowed steadily to the Africa Corps began to vanish beneath the sea. Within just 2 months, Rommel's advance stalled at El Alamein. British forces under Montgomery launched their counteroffensive. And behind the headlines, hidden from the public, lay the true engine of this turnaround. The fuel delivered by a dying American tanker, pushed into port by 2 British destroyers. For Malta, Pedestal became a symbol of endurance. The island was later awarded the George Cross for collective bravery, a rare honor recognizing the suffering and resilience of its people. Veterans who survived the convoy remembered it not as a victory, but as a test of will, a moment when duty overpowered fear. Ohio, too damaged to sail again, remained fused to the dock for months. Her cracked hull and scorched deck became a quiet monument. Sailors walked past her and touched the steel as though greeting an old friend. She had given everything she had and more. In the decades that followed, historians revisited Pedestal with awe. It stood as one of the most daring logistical operations of the war, a battle where courage, sacrifice, and sheer determination mattered as much as firepower. Operation Pedestal did not win the war, but it prevented defeat, and for Malta, for North Africa, for the Mediterranean, that made all the difference.